Picture the highest tide of the month. A merchant ship the size of a parish church is being walked in on ropes, her ballast already lifted out of her, her hull light and vulnerable. For 6 weeks your men have been driving fresh oak into her flank. The cradle underneath her is brand new, oak and elm, cut and assembled on the river mud for this one job, this one ship, this one contract. She settles onto it. The timber takes her weight, and for a few beautiful seconds, everything holds. Then the starboard side goes. 200 tons of another man's property rolls over in front of you and begins quietly filling with river water. And here is the first thing nobody tells you about the medieval shipyard business. That ship, the enormous thing now drowning on your slipway, is somebody else's. It belonged to the buyer from the moment the keel was laid. You built it. You will not own a single plank of it. And it was never, not for one day, the way you were going to get rich. So let's do something the history books almost never do. Let's forget the romance, forget the master craftsman with the sea in his blood. Forget the politics, forget the kings and their glorious fleets, and let's look at the one thing that actually decided who ate and who went under.
Look out, she's
Let's
going
look at the
over.
accounts,
Get back quickly.
because when you price this trade properly, every plank, every nail, every wage, every day, the answer comes out strange. And the strangeness is the whole story. Here is the myth. The myth is that a shipyard is a place, a building, a grand permanent structure on the water with a proud sign over the gate and generations of the same family hammering away inside it. That's the picture in your head right now, and I understand why. It's the picture in almost everyone's head. It is also almost entirely wrong. England did not really have shipyards for most of the Middle Ages. Not in the way you're imagining. Ships were built wherever 3 things happened to meet: timber, water, and labor. A riverbank, a beach, a tidal creek behind a town. That was your yard. Purpose-built, permanent yards don't become normal in England until the early 15th century. And even then, only barely. Before that, a shipyard wasn't a place at all. A shipyard was an event. It happened. It ran for as long as the job ran. Then it stopped happening, the men walked away, and the ground quietly went back to being ground. And this held true even at the very top of the market, even for kings. When Henry V ordered the largest ship England had ever attempted, they
All
didn't
together.
send him to some
Heave hard
established
now.
royal shipyard, because there wasn't really one to send him to. Instead, a dock was cut near Town Quay in Southampton, dug specifically to build that one vessel. Not a permanent naval facility. A hole in the ground, excavated for a single customer, for a single ship. That is the reality behind the phrase, the king's shipyard. It was a hole. Don't take my word for it. Go looking for the physical remains of these places today, and you'll mostly find fields. At Small Hythe in Kent, a river-connected community that genuinely built ships for the crown. What survives is earthworks under grass. Bumps in a meadow. Yards went up where the wood was, did their work, and then vanished so completely that we have to reconstruct them from bumps in a meadow and a handful of surviving account rolls. This is not a trade that left cathedrals behind. It left post holes and mud. So if the yard isn't really a place, what are you actually buying when you own one? Watch this carefully, because this is where the follow the money begins. You are not buying the forest. You buy trees, individually, from men who own woodland, and you pay their price. You are not buying the iron. That arrives from a smith who prices it by weight and doesn't much care what you do with it. And you are absolutely not buying the ship because, as we've established, the ship belongs to the buyer from the day the keel touches the ground. So sit with the absurdity of it. The single largest, most valuable object standing on your property is legally somebody else's. What you own is a slope of mud, a stack of wood, and a promise. That's the yard. A slope, a stack, and a promise. And before we start spending money, one adjustment, because it matters. If you have any feel at all for medieval money, the feel you'd get from a butcher's shop or a village smithy, trades that turn on a few pennies a day, I need you to put that instinct down right now. It will lie to you here. This trade does not run in pennies, it runs in hundreds of pounds. And here's the part that ruins men. You will not see a single penny of that money come back for the better part of a year. You pay first, you pay for months, and the object you're paying to create belongs to somebody else the entire time. So let's build one from bare ground, and let's do it somewhere real. Let's put our yard on the water at Southampton in the 1410s, because that is where the surviving evidence is thickest, and because there is a man there worth following. His name is William Soper. He's a merchant, and he is about to start building warships for Henry V. We are going to follow William Soper for the rest of this story, because his career is, quite literally, the entire lesson in one man. But right now, at this moment, Soper has exactly what you have. Bare ground. Nothing else. Let's spend. Cost 1, the frontage. You need a bank that slopes down into water deep enough to float whatever you build, which is far rarer than it sounds. Too steep, and your men can't work on it. Too shallow, and your finished hull sits stranded in the mud until the next equinox tide. Tidal frontage on the right kind of slope is worth paying real money for, because the tide does your heaviest lifting for free. That's your first cost, and it's rent or purchase on land that somebody already owns. Cost 2, the slip. This is the prepared path the finished hull rests on and slides down into the water. Timber, packed ground, grease. And here's a small detail that tells you everything about this trade. The slip is the only part of your entire yard whose whole purpose is to be used exactly once, for about 90 seconds, right at the very end. You build it to destroy it. Cost 3, the saw pits. 2 men to a pit, one standing up top in daylight, one down underneath in the dark, eating falling sawdust all day. You'll need several running at once, because a hull swallows planks faster than any 2 men alive can cut them. Cost 4, the smithy. Set it near the water. Every single fastening in that ship comes out of it. We won't linger here. In this story, the forge is a line in your accounts, not a character. But hold on to it, because the iron is about to surprise you. Cost 5, the pitch house. The smell of the entire trade. Boiling, black, unmistakable. Cost 6, and this is the real one, the timber stack. This is your yard's actual inventory and its actual risk, all at once. Green wood warps and ruins your ship. Seasoned wood costs more and takes years you simply do not have. And every single log lying in that stack is capital, money, sitting out in the open air where it can be stolen, where it can burn, and, crucially, where it can be walked up to and valued by a royal officer. Remember that last one. It's going to come back and it's going to hurt. Cost 7, the tools. Adzes, hammers, augers, draw knives, caulking irons, mallets. And I want you to pay very close attention to this line, because almost nobody in the yard notices it at the time, and it decides everything at the end. Who owns the tools? File that away. Cost 8, the watchman. 1 man, paid to do absolutely nothing except confirm every morning that the previous 7 items are still where you left them. He is the only wage that keeps running even when all the work stops. Cost 9, the working capital, wages, every week. For something close to a year before there is a single finished object to hand to anybody. 9 things. Count them again. The ground, the slip, the saw pits, the smithy, the pitch house, the timber stack, the tools, the watchman, the wages. That is your entire empire. Now look at what's missing from that list. The ship. The ship is not on the list of things you own because the ship was never yours. And this is the trap the fantasy walks you straight into. You picture yourself as a builder, a craftsman, a maker of beautiful, valuable things. But look hard at what you've just bought. You've bought a slope of mud you're renting, a stack of somebody else's future timber, a shed full of tools that, as we'll see, may not even belong to you, and a wage bill that bleeds out, week after week after week, for the better part of a year, financing the creation of an enormous asset that becomes another man's property the instant you begin. So far, this is a superb method for spending a fortune and giving away a ship, which raises the only question that matters, the one this entire investigation is built to answer. If the building itself is a money-losing machine, if the ship is never yours, if the yard vanishes back into a field the moment the job ends, then how exactly did anybody get rich doing this? Because somebody did. William Soper died holding an estate near the New Forest, having sat in Parliament 11 times. The master shipwright, the one man on that entire site who could look at a curved tree and see a hull hidden inside it, walked home at the end of every job carrying his own tools because they'd never belonged to the yard in the first place. Same mud, same wood, same water, two completely different lives. The difference between those two men is the difference between what the history books record and what actually happened. And to see it, we have to stop looking at the ship and start reading the accounts. Because in 1294, a clerk in Newcastle wrote down what a warship cost, down to the last farthing. And the gap between what he wrote and what the job actually cost is the most important number in this entire story. That number is where we go next. So you've bought your slope of mud. You've dug your saw pits, lit your pitch house, stacked your timber out in the open air where a royal officer can walk up and price it. 9 costs, and not one of them is the ship. Now the obvious question, what does all of it actually come to? Put a real number on it. Because until you can price this thing, everything I've told you is just atmosphere. Here is our problem, and it's a problem that's going to shadow us all the way to the end. The best surviving English answer to what did a warship cost is about 120 years older than the yard we're building at Southampton. So we don't get to treat it as a quote for Soper's ships. We treat it as a benchmark, a way to feel the shape of the money. And the benchmark comes from 1294, when Edward I did something that, for our purposes, was extraordinarily convenient. He ordered war galleys from 20 English ports all at once and demanded accounts. Most of those accounts are gone, but Newcastle's survive, and they are a rare, precious thing. A clerk sitting in a field in the north of England, writing down, line by line, what it cost to build a ship of war. So let's read his ledger over his shoulder. Timber, £50, 8 shillings and 4p. Nails, £22, 16 shillings, 7p halfpenny. Pitch, tar and caulking material, £11, 2 shillings. Carpenter's wages, £66, 4 shillings, a penny and 3 farthings. Add those recorded inputs together, and the clerk's total comes to £150, 11 shillings, a penny and a farthing. £150. Hold that figure. Now here is the number that matters more than it has any right to. Later summaries of that same ship put the real all-in figure closer to £205. Stop and look at that gap. Roughly £50, somewhere near a quarter of the entire cost of the ship, sitting in the space between what the clerk wrote down and what the job actually cost. And I want to be careful here, because that gap is not the sign of a bad clerk or sloppy history. That gap is the exact distance between the world of official records and the world of real business. The clerk wrote down the things clerks write down: timber, nails, pitch, wages, countable things, state things. The other £50 is everything that happened in the cracks, the incidentals, the extras, the arrangements, the money that flowed through a job without anyone having a reason to itemize it. Remember that £50. We are going to find it again at the very end of this story, and when we do, it's going to explain the whole trade. Now, a raw number like £150 means nothing until you can feel it in your hands. So let's anchor it to the only currency that never lies: human labour. In this period, a labourer's day is worth about 4p, which means a single pound is roughly 60 days of a working man's life. 60 days. And Newcastle, in 1294, sits in cheaper times, when unskilled labour cost closer to half that. So run the arithmetic. That £150 warship represents something in the order of 18,000 days of human effort. Men standing in a muddy field in the north of England, working from dawn. 18,000 days. And here's the part that should stop you cold. At that point in the process, you have not yet cut down a single tree. That's the effort just to reach the starting line. So who were these people? Because the fantasy has one hero in it, the lone genius shipwright, and the accounts kill that fantasy stone dead. 21 men built that Newcastle galley. 41 weeks, keel to launch. And when you read the list of who they actually were, the romantic image collapses completely. A master shipwright and his assistant, yes. But then carpenters, hammermen, men called holders up, whose entire job was to brace a red-hot rivet from the far side of the hull while somebody else hammered it flat. Painters, riggers, smiths, sawyers, a whole squad brought in for one purpose only: getting the finished hull down the slip and into the water. A watchman, and, this is the detail I love because of why we know it, Women hired to clear the wood chips off the site. We only know those women were ever there because somebody wrote down their wages. They were paid, therefore they were recorded, therefore they exist in history. Everyone who wasn't paid in a way a clerk noticed has simply vanished. That is not a workshop. That is not a craftsman and his apprentices. That is a village, a temporary purpose-built settlement of specialists, with a lifespan of exactly 41 weeks. And every single one of them is paid weekly, in coin, by you. Nothing comes back in until the ship is finally handed over to its owner. So walk yourself forward 4 months into the job. You have now spent a genuine fortune in weekly wages, and what do you own? A shape, a wooden skeleton on a slope. 4 months of a labourer's whole life, times 21, and you own a shape. Now, finally, the trees. Here's a modern data point that makes the scale real, because it was actually done. When a Viking-scale hull was rebuilt in our own time, using period methods, it consumed 14 mature oaks, each roughly 3 feet across, worked by 8 men and an apprentice. 14 oaks for a relatively modest hull. Now scale that upward toward a real warship, and the numbers turn frightening. One great 16th century warship is estimated to have swallowed something like 600 mature oaks. Call it 40 acres of woodland, an entire forest, vanishing into a single hull. Treat that 600 as a reconstruction rather than a receipt, because only a fraction of that particular ship survives for us to measure. But the order of magnitude is the point, and the order of magnitude is brutal. Every hull you launch is a forest that no longer exists. You are not just building a ship. You are permanently spending a landscape. Then there's the least glamorous line in the entire ledger, the one that actually decides whether the thing floats. The caulking, the waterproofing of the seams. Caulking recovered from real medieval wrecks turns up moss, plant fibre, animal hair, and in one case even worked in wool, all driven hard into the seams and sealed under pitch. And here's what's remarkable. No standard recipe survives because there wasn't one. Yards used whatever was abundant and cheap in the local hedgerow. Sit with that. The single most valuable object in the entire county, a warship worth £200, worth 18,000 days of human life, was being kept afloat by whatever plant matter the men could gather from the ditch nearby. The glamour of the enterprise and the reality of the enterprise could not be further apart. Now let me show you the number that ambushes everyone who has ever paid for building work. Go back to that Newcastle ledger. The nails came to £22. The carpenters, across all 41 weeks, came to 66. Do the division. The iron holding that ship together cost roughly a third of every wage paid on the entire site. In a trade that everyone on Earth pictures as woodwork, as sawing and shaping and joinery, the humble fastenings, the nails and rivets, are eating a third of your payroll. The thing you never think about is a third of the bill. And none of that iron, by the way, is local, nor is much of the wood. The ship this story opened with, the one drowning on the slip, was planked with oak felled about 100 miles inland, in the Basque country of northern Spain. Baltic oak moved west by the shipload into English and Flemish ports. So look at where your yard actually sits, at the very far end of a supply line that begins in a forest inside somebody else's kingdom. And every single link in that chain, the felling, the hauling, the shipping, the customs, can be cut by weather, by war, or by one customs officer having a difficult week. You have built a business whose core raw material has to survive a journey across a sea and a border before it ever reaches your mud. Your costs are set in a forest you'll never see, priced in a currency you don't control, moved by ships you don't own. So let's total up honestly what we've found so far. To build one warship, you commit hundreds of pounds, the equivalent of tens of thousands of days of human life.
By royal decree,
you raise and pay a temporary village of 21 specialists for the better part of a year. You consume acres of oak that took a century to grow and will not grow back on any timescale that matters to you. You depend on a fragile international supply line for both your wood and your iron. You seal the whole thing with weeds from a ditch, and at the end of it, you hand the enormous finished object to somebody else, because it was legally theirs from the day you laid the keel. Every stream of cost flows out of you, not one flows back in. Read like that, this is not a business, It's a beautifully organized way to convert a fortune into somebody else's property. Any rational man reading these accounts in 1294 or 1414 should have run in the opposite direction. And yet the ports of England and the lagoon of Venice were full of men who did exactly this, year after year, generation after generation. And some of them died wealthy, landed, and sitting in Parliament. Which means the accounts are hiding something. The clerk wrote down the timber and the nails and the wages because those were the things the state cared about, the things the state was paying for and checking. But the state was never interested in your margin. The receipts that survive are the receipts the Crown kept, and the Crown had no reason on earth to record how a private shipbuilder actually made his living. So the money, the real money, was flowing somewhere the ledger simply doesn't look. To find it, we have to stop asking what the ship cost to build. We have to start asking a completely different question. Not what did it cost to make, but who was standing in the right place after it floated. Because the man who got rich was not the man who built the ship. He was the man who understood that the building was only the entry fee, and that the actual business began the moment the hull hit the water. The accounts say this business loses money. Every cost flows out, the ship flows away, the yard reverts to a field. And yet men did this for generations, and some died rich. So the money is real. It's just hiding somewhere the clerk never looked. Now we go and find it. And I'll warn you now, once you see where it was, you will never look at a shipbuilder the same way again. Because almost none of the money came from building ships. Start with the most obvious stream, and then watch it get less obvious 4 separate times over. 1. Repair. Here's the reframe that unlocks everything. A wooden ship is not a product. It's a subscription. It never stops needing you. Seams work loose, planks split, worm gets into anything sitting below the waterline, and sooner or later, every vessel afloat has to come out of the water and be gone over by people who know exactly what they're doing. Now compare that to a build. A build is a year of wages paid out before you see a penny. A repair is small, fast, and, this is the key, it does not require you to finance a village for 11 months on faith. The customer brings you a leaking hull, you fix it, you get paid. It is endless, it is low risk, and it is the exact opposite of the money-losing machine we spent so long describing. Venice worked this out before anyone else on Earth.
Quickly.
The Arsenal of Venice, the single most famous shipyard in all of Europe, the name that echoes down history, began around the year 1104, not as a place to build ships at all. It began as a place to maintain and repair privately built ones. And it did not become a serious builder for another 2 centuries. Read that again, because it rearranges everything. The most powerful naval yard on the continent spent its first 200 years as, essentially, a garage. Writing around 1315, Dante described the place in its off-season, men caulking the hulls of ships that cannot sail, boiling pitch, one hammering at the prow while another hammers at the stern. That's the picture I want you to hold. Winter, the season you'd assume was dead, is not your dead season at all. Winter is your other business. Repair doesn't wait for good weather. Repair is always in season, because ships are always failing. 2. Stores. Quieter than repair, and better. Every ship that comes into your yard needs rope, canvas, pitch, nails, spars.
Heave hard now.
And here's the trick that turns a sideline into a fortune. So does every ship that's going absolutely nowhere. A vessel laid up for the winter still needs supplying. This is where a man named Robert Brigandine walks into the story, and he is worth studying closely. When Henry VII made Brigandine clerk of the king's ships in 1495, the salary was almost insulting. 12 pence a day, with another 6 pence a day to hire himself a clerk. Trivial money, rounding error money. But look at what the post actually granted him. The explicit right to profit from supplying ships' requisites while those vessels were being fitted out or laid up and not at sea. Do you see what just happened? Brigandine wasn't really being paid to run the king's ships. He was being paid in the right to sell things to them. The wage was a decoy. The supply monopoly was the prize. 3. Upkeep on ships that never move. This one sounds absurd until you see the numbers. Henry V's great ship launched in 1418 and made exactly 1 voyage in 1420. On that single voyage part of her crew mutinied. She put in at the Isle of Wight and she never went to sea again. So she was finished, useless, done. Except she then sat at her mooring in the Hamble, maintained by a permanent crew of 8 men, until 1439. Read that back slowly. 19 years of continuous paid upkeep on a vessel that had already finished being useful in her second year. 19 years of somebody drawing wages to look after a ship that did nothing. Because here's the quiet truth of it. A ship going nowhere still leaks. And where there's a leak, somebody is billing for it. A useless ship is not a dead asset to the man maintaining it. It's an annuity. 4. Salvage. Rebuilding a new hull on the frame of an old one was standard practice, and the arithmetic is obvious once you say it out loud. You sell off the outdated fittings and the scrap, and you cut the timber bill on the replacement. A dead ship is not a loss. A dead ship is a warehouse. That same great ship of Henry V's. She burned to the waterline in 1439 after a lightning strike, and a gang of 10 labourers went straight in to recover the metal fixtures. The Basque merchantman drowning on our slip back in the opening lost her anchors, her masts, her guns, and her heavy rigging before anyone would even admit she was finished. You strip a dying ship the way you'd strip a carcass. Nothing valuable is allowed to sink with her, so already we have 4 ways to make money, and not one of them is build a ship and sell it. Repair, stores, upkeep, salvage. But now, the 5th. The one that actually matters. The one that is the entire lesson in a single human being. William Soper, our Southampton merchant. Follow exactly what this man did, because it's a masterclass. Soper ended up supervising the construction of Henry V's fleet. He built the King's Navy. And then he also, and this is the whole story compressed into one sentence, owned ships himself. The Julian of Hampton, rated at 140 tons, was out supporting a naval patrol in 1418. He later acquired a vessel called the Valentine directly out of the Royal Fleet itself, the very fleet he had helped build. And in 1426 he sent her to Bordeaux, loaded with grain, coal, fish and cloth. Trace that sequence, because it's the most important sequence in this entire story. He built the King's Navy. Then he bought a ship out of the navy he had just built. Then he ran commercial freight with it for his own private profit. The yard was never the business. Say that again. The yard was never the business. The yard was simply how you got close enough to the real business to buy your way into it. Building ships was the ticket. Owning and running them was the show. Now let's price the difference so you feel the size of the gap. In Venice, chartering a single merchant galley for one voyage could run to something like 9,200 ducats before you'd loaded a single barrel of cargo. Meanwhile, the men who physically built those hulls, who shaped the oak with their own hands, were paid by the day. Same water, same wood. The margin was never, ever in the making of the ship. The margin was in being on the right side of the thing once it floated. The builder got a wage, the owner got 9,000 ducats a voyage. Same ship, which raises the fair and obvious question. If these royal officers, clerk of the king's ships, surveyor and the rest, paid almost nothing, if 12 pence a day was a rounding error, then why did every ambitious man in the port want one so badly? And the answer is the deepest point in this whole investigation. Because you weren't being paid in money, you were being paid in position. Soper drew a shilling a day as surveyor of the king's ships. Brigandine drew 12 pence. Against the vast sums flowing through their hands, that's nothing. What the office actually bought you was 3 things money can't. The supply monopoly on stores, first refusal when the Crown broke up its fleet, which is exactly how Soper got the Valentine, and a legal standing from which to trade in your own name. And how do we know those privileges were worth having? Because men broke the law to get them. Repeatedly, and in public. A petition to the Parliament of 1390 had demanded specifically that no customs officer be allowed to own ships of his own, or involve himself in the freight of other men's cargo, a rule that exists precisely because the conflict of interest was already obvious to everyone. And William Soper. Soper was, simultaneously, the King's Clerk of Ships, a customs official at Southampton, and a merchant shipping his own cargo. He was, in one body, the referee, the regulator, and the player. On one occasion, a royal searcher stopped the master of Soper's Valentine and asked him to produce his license for exporting 700 quarters of corn. The master's response was to make sail and simply leave. He didn't argue. He didn't produce papers. He weighed anchor and sailed away from the king's own officer, and nothing happened. That is what the position was worth, not a shilling a day. The power to ignore the law to your face and get away with it. So this is your answer to the mystery. This is the trade with 3, 4, 5 separate ways to get paid, and the richest of them all is the one that doesn't appear as shipbuilding anywhere in any ledger. The margin in this business came from policy, not from craft. You are not really a builder. You are a defense contractor who happens to own some adzes. And the real money is in the contracts, the offices, and the ownership, not in the sawdust. But, and I have to be honest with you, because this isn't a sales pitch, the very same arrangement that made men like Soper rich could also destroy you, and from the same source, the crown. Purveyance gave the crown the right to take what it needed at an appraised price rather than a market one. And after a century of inflation, appraised meant a fraction of true worth. Remember that timber stack I told you to hold on to? A royal officer can walk up, value it, and cart it off, and you'll be paid what he says it's worth eventually on a piece of paper. Your skilled men could go the same way. Ship carpenters were impressed for royal work exactly like sailors were, and refusing carried a prison term. And underneath all of it sat a timing problem that could sink the healthiest yard. The crown was a magnificent customer and an appalling payer. You did the work first and were settled with later. Sometimes years later, sometimes against tax revenue nobody had even collected yet, on the strength of a written promise. For long stretches, you weren't being paid by the king at all. You were financing the king's navy out of your own pocket and praying the paper would one day be honored. So here is where we've arrived. The building loses money. The real money hides in repair, stores, upkeep, salvage, and above all in ownership and office. But every one of those golden streams runs directly through the hand of a single, powerful, unreliable patron. Take away that patron, or let one thing go wrong on a calm afternoon, and every stream dries up at once, which is precisely what we're about to watch happen. Because there's a ship in the silt of a Welsh river that has been waiting 534 years to show us exactly how fast all of this can come apart. We've built this business up. The mud, the village of 21, the acres of vanished oak, the hidden streams of money, repair, stores, upkeep, salvage, and the great prize of ownership and office. By now, it might even look attractive. 3, 4, 5 ways to get paid. A clever man in the right port, holding the right office, could do very well. So let me show you what takes all of it away in a single afternoon. Not over a bad year. Not through some slow decline. In one afternoon, in perfect weather, with nobody doing anything obviously wrong. Newport, on the River Usk, in South Wales. The spring of 1468. The ship is the one from the very opening of this story. The merchantman, the size of a parish church. She's around 200 tons, roughly 10 years old, and she was built far away in the Basque country. She's come into your yard for a major refit,
steady,
and this is exactly the kind of job we've spent this whole time calling the good money. Not a year-long build with your fortune bleeding out in wages. A refit. Serious, well-paid, months-long work on somebody else's asset. She's been floated into a side channel on the highest tide of the month, her ballast lifted out and lowered carefully onto a cradle your own men built specifically for her. English oak is being shaped and driven into a Spanish hull. This is the best thing on your books. This is the winter that carries the summer. This is you doing everything right. And then the starboard supports fail. That's it. No storm, no enemy, no fire. The props holding 200 tons of another man's ship simply give way on a calm afternoon, and she goes over. The exact scene we opened with, the wood taking her weight for a few seconds, and then the starboard side letting go. She cannot be refloated. Everything worth taking is stripped off her, because a dead ship is a warehouse, remember, and you salvage the carcass. And what's left of her settles into the silt of the Usk and stays there. For 534 years. Which, by the way, is the only reason we can tell you any of this. We know about the Newport ship because she never came back up. The evidence of the disaster is the disaster itself, preserved in mud for 5 centuries. Now, count the cost properly, because the repair fee you just lost is the smallest part of it. That's the mistake everyone makes. They think, a job went wrong, you lost the job. No, look at what actually fell over on your slipway. You lost a merchant ship, 200 tons, roughly 10 years old, and almost certainly that merchant's single principal asset. Gone. On top of that, you lost the cargo trade she was booked to run for the next several years. Her future earnings, which don't belong to you, but which you have now personally erased. And then, worst of all, you lost the one thing this trade cannot survive without: the reputation of a yard where ships fall over. Think about the world you operate in. A port town, every ship owner within 50 miles drinks in the same 3 rooms. There is no anonymity, no fresh start, no moving to the next county where nobody's heard. By the time you've walked home from the Usk that evening, everyone who might ever hire you knows that a ship went over on your cradle in flat, calm weather. And there is no insurance, none. No underwriter to spread the loss, no policy to argue that it wasn't your fault, no mechanism anywhere in the medieval world to convert this catastrophe into a claim. One afternoon has just ended a business that took a decade to assemble, and no piece of paper exists to say otherwise. So now watch the yard come apart. And watch it carefully, because it disassembles in precisely the reverse order you built it. 9 things, and not one of them survives the end of a contract. Working capital goes first. It was never really there to begin with. It left as wages, week by week, months ago. There is no reserve, no cushion, no cash sitting in a box. The moment the income stops, there is simply nothing. The watchman is next. He's the last man you can justify keeping, and the very first who starts to look like pure waste. Why pay a man to guard a yard that no longer has a future? So he goes. The tools walk out, and here is the line I told you to file away right at the very beginning. The tools, the adzes, the augers, the caulking irons, leave with the master shipwright. Because they were always his. They were never the yard's. In good times, nobody noticed or cared. But at the end, when everything is being counted, the single most valuable movable thing on the site simply gets picked up and carried home by the one man skilled enough to own it. You never owned your own tools. The timber stack, your great pile of capital sitting in the open air, either rots where it lies or a royal purveyor walks up, values it at whatever figure he likes, and carts it off. Exactly as I warned you. The thing you were told to remember comes back, at the worst possible moment, and takes itself away. The pitch house, the smithy, the saw pits, worth exactly what the scrap weighs, and nothing more. The forge sells for the price of its iron. The pitch house gets burned for fuel by somebody who needs a fire more than he needs a business. And the slip and the ground. The slip silts up within a single season. And the ground goes back to being ground. A slope of mud with some post holes in it. The field forgets you were ever there. 9 things. That was the whole empire. Not one of them survives the end of a single contract. And notice what this tells you about the trade. It was never solid. It only ever looked solid while the money was flowing. Underneath, it was always a slope, a stack, and a promise. And when the promise broke, there was nothing left to fall back on. Now, Newport is the fast version, the afternoon version. But I don't want you to think you're safe just because your supports hold. Because there's a slower way to lose exactly the same business, and this one doesn't require anybody to make a single mistake. Go back to William Soper, the man who did everything right, who built the navy and bought into it and sat in Parliament. Henry V died in 1422. And here's what happened to the fleet Soper built. The king's ships were treated as his personal property and simply sold off to settle his debts. The navy Soper had spent his life assembling was liquidated to pay a dead man's bills. Soper himself stayed in his post until 1442. But by that point, there was effectively no fleet left to keep. Sit with what that means for the business model. Soper's entire order book had been one man, one patron, the king. And when the king died, the business died with him, on a delay. It didn't matter that Soper was brilliant, connected, and careful. His whole enterprise had been built on a single human life, and human lives end. That's the funeral version. No storm, no collapse, just a death, and a business that quietly runs out of reasons to exist. And then there's the slowest version of all, and Venice met it. From the middle of the 15th century, The reachable oak, larch and fir around Venice were being depleted beyond recovery. The greatest naval power in the Mediterranean was running out of trees. Conservation was attempted, and it failed, for a reason that is almost tragic in its simplicity. Forests do not refill on a business timescale. A man needs oak this decade. An oak needs a century. Those two clocks cannot be reconciled, and when they collide, the business loses. That's the century version. Not an afternoon, not a funeral, 100 years of quiet exhaustion, of cutting faster than the land can grow, until one day the raw material of your entire civilization's sea power simply isn't there anymore. So there they are. 3 ways to lose this business, and you should price all 3 before you ever put a shovel in the ground. An afternoon, the supports give way on a calm day, and it's over before sundown.
Let no man move it under
a funeral,
penalty of death.
Your one patron dies, and the whole edifice unwinds. Or a century, the forest itself runs out, and no amount of cleverness can conjure an oak from bare ground. Fast, medium, slow. Bad luck, mortality, or ecology. Pick your poison, and here is the cruelty of the arithmetic, the thing that makes this trade so much more brutal than it first appears. In a good year, your build contract runs. Your refit book fills the winter, your stores are moving, you hold a share in a hull that's out-earning freight while you sleep, and you're a man of standing in the port. Beautiful. But in a bad year, the numbers turn on you from 4 directions at once. Your patron cancels or dies. A purveyor values your timber and takes it. Baltic prices move, and suddenly the oak you need is coming 500 miles at somebody else's number. All the supports under a client's ship give way on a calm afternoon. Any one of those on its own can finish you. And meanwhile, this is the part that has no mercy in it. The ground, the watchman, and the master shipwright you cannot afford to lose to the next town all cost exactly what they cost in a good year. Fixed costs do not read the room. They do not know it's a bad year. They arrive on schedule every week, whether you can pay them or not. So the honest ledger of this trade is not sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. It's far more lopsided than that. In a good year, you make a comfortable, unspectacular living, thin margins on builds, and a decent book of refits. In a bad year, and a bad year can be triggered by a single afternoon, a single death, a single shift in a market you don't control, you lose everything you spent a decade assembling, permanently, with no insurance and no second chance. That's not a business with ordinary ups and downs. That's a business where the downside is total and the upside is modest. Where one calm afternoon on the Usk outweighs 10 good years. Which forces the real question, the one the whole thing has been circling. If the building loses money, and the disasters are total, and the good years are only comfortable, then how is it that history remembers this as a proud, prosperous trade at all? Why do the accounts survive telling us to the farthing what the iron cost, while the men who supposedly grew rich left almost no trace of their profit? Because the official version of this story was never written by the men who built the ships. It was written by the state that kept the receipts, and the state was recording something completely different from what was actually going on. Here's the strange thing we've arrived at, and I want to state it as plainly as I can before we explain it. We know an astonishing amount about medieval shipbuilding. We can tell you that the nails on the 1294 Newcastle galley cost £22, 16 shillings, 7p halfpenny. We can tell you the carpenters came to £66 across 41 weeks. We can tell you there were 21 men and that women were hired to sweep the wood chips. We can tell you the pitch, the tar, the caulking, the timber, line by line to the farthing, 700 years later. And yet we cannot tell you what a single private shipbuilder actually earned in a year, anywhere, in all of medieval England. Not Soper, not Brigandine, not the master shipwright at Newcastle, nobody. We know the cost of everything and the profit of no one. Now, why? Because this is the moment the whole thing turns. The official version of history isn't lying to us out of malice or conspiracy. It's lying to us by omission, and the omission has a cause, and the cause explains the entire trade. So let's follow it. Start with the simplest question. Who kept these records and why? The answer is the Crown. The receipts that survive are the receipts the state kept. And here is the thing you have to understand about the state as a record keeper. It only ever wrote down what it cared about. And what it cared about was what it was paying for. When the king commissioned a warship, his clerks recorded the timber because the king was buying timber. They recorded the nails because the king was buying nails. They recorded the wages because the king was paying wages. Every line in that ledger exists because the crown needed to check that its own money was being spent on the thing it had ordered. But the crown was never, not for 1 second, interested in your margin. Why would it be? Your profit wasn't the king's business. The king wanted a ship at a controlled price. What you managed to make on the side, the refit you fitted in over the winter, the coil of rope you sold quietly off the stack, the quarter share you held in a hull, the office worth 12 pence a day, and a great deal more than that in practice. None of that appeared anywhere, because nobody with the power to write it down had any reason to. The clerk recorded the state's costs. Your income wasn't a cost to the state, so it simply doesn't exist in the record. It fell straight through the floor of history. And now go back and look again at that £50 gap, the distance between the £150 the Newcastle clerk wrote down and the £205 that later summaries put the ship's real cost at. I told you to remember it. Here is what it actually was. That gap is not sloppiness. That gap is the exact shape of everything the record doesn't capture. It's the distance between what a clerk writes and what a job costs, and by extension, between what the state saw and what actually happened in the yard. £50, a full quarter of the ship, living in the cracks of the official account. And if a quarter of the cost could hide from the record, imagine how completely the profit could hide. The profit wasn't a slightly underreported line. It was in a different category of thing entirely, the kind of thing account rolls are structurally incapable of seeing. So when you open a modern history of medieval shipbuilding, and it reads like a list of materials, so much oak, so many nails, this much pitch, that is not because shipbuilding was a list of materials. It's because materials are what clerks write down. Timber has a price and a quantity. Nails can be counted. These things fit into a ledger. The part of the trade that actually made anyone wealthy. The refit nobody itemized. The stores sold on the side, the share in a hull, the supply monopoly attached to an office, was never going to turn up in an account roll because none of the people involved had the slightest reason to record it. In fact, they had every reason not to. Why would William Soper, simultaneously the King's Clerk of Ships, a customs officer, and a private merchant shipping his own corn, write down the mechanics of how those three roles fed one another? The whole value of that arrangement depended on it not being written down. This is the deeper point, and it's the one I most want you to walk away with. The historical record of this trade isn't neutral. It isn't a fair photograph of what happened. It's a photograph taken from one specific angle, the state's angle, and everything outside that frame is simply dark. We inherited the Crown's paperwork, so we inherited the Crown's blind spots. And the Crown's single biggest blind spot was the exact place where the money was made. Now let me be careful and fair here. This is not a story of some grand cover-up, of documents deliberately burned to hide the truth from us. There's no secret vault, no conspiracy of clerks. The mechanism is quieter and, honestly, more interesting than a conspiracy. It's selection. The records that survived are the ones that somebody powerful had a reason to create and keep, and that somebody was almost always the state, chasing its own money. The records that would have told us what the shipbuilder made were never created in the first place, because the only person who knew those numbers was the shipbuilder, and he had every incentive in the world to keep them in his head. The history got written by the tax collector, not the taxpayer, and the tax collector wrote down what he was owed, not what you kept. You can see the same selection at work in who even makes it into the story as a person. Remember those women at Newcastle, hired to clear the wood chips? We know they existed for one reason and one reason only. They were paid in a way a clerk recorded. Every other uncredited hand on that site, everyone whose labor didn't happen to generate a line in the state's accounts, has vanished completely. The record doesn't preserve what was important. It preserves what was invoiced to the Crown. Importance and invoicing are two different things, and confusing them is how you end up with a history of shipbuilding that's really just a history of royal purchase orders. So let's put the official version and the real version side by side, honestly. The official version says shipbuilding was a craft. Skilled men built ships for kings and merchants. Here is what the materials cost. Here is what the wages came to. The whole thing is a matter of timber and iron and honest labor. That version is accurate. Every number in it is real and checkable. But it is only half the truth, and it happens to be the half that flatters everyone who kept the records. It makes the Crown look like a straightforward customer buying a straightforward product at a fair, documented price. The real version says the craft was the entry fee, not the business. The documented build was the loss leader. The money lived in the undocumented margins, in ownership, in office, in supply monopolies, in the right to sail past a royal searcher and simply not stop. And the reason we can't see that money is that the men who made it were often the same men who profited from the record staying incomplete. Soper's whole position depended on the conflict of interest not being examined too closely, which is precisely why a parliament in 1390 had to pass a rule against customs officers owning ships, and precisely why men like Soper carried on doing it anyway. The gap in the record and the profit in the trade are the same gap. The silence is not empty. The silence is where the money was. Do you see how the official history ends up serving the very people it appears to be neutrally describing? Not through any lie, but through the shape of what got kept. A record built entirely out of the state's purchase orders will always make the trade look like honest, transparent craftsmanship, because that's the only part the state ever looked at. The institutional self-dealing, the offices bought for their supply rights, the ships quietly extracted from the royal fleet by the men who built it, all of that sits in the dark, not because someone hid it, but because the light was only ever pointed at the timber and the nails. And this is why the story matters far beyond ships. Anytime you read a history of anything that reads like a clean list of official figures, this cost that much, this many were built, here are the wages, you should ask the Newcastle question. Who kept this record, and what were they paying for? Because the answer tells you what you're allowed to see and what you're not. The receipts that survive are almost never the ones that show you where the real money went. They're the ones that show you where the state's money went. And those are very, very different maps. So we've solved the mystery of the missing profit. It was never recorded because the only people who could have recorded it were the Crown, which didn't care, and the shipbuilders, who didn't dare. We know what the wood cost because the king was buying wood. We don't know what the men made because nobody was auditing their cleverness. But there's one last thing this record does let us do, and it's the most damning thing of all. It lets us compare two men who stood in exactly the same mud. Because although we can't read anyone's income, we can read what men ended up owning. So could you actually get rich owning a medieval shipyard? Here is the honest answer, and I want to give it to you straight, because it isn't a dodge. It's the whole finding. Yes, you could get rich. But not from shipbuilding. Every single route to real money in this trade ran through the yard and out the other side. Into ownership, into office, into supply. The building itself was never the destination. The building was the entry fee. You paid your fortune, you financed your village of 21 for 11 months, you handed over an asset that was never yours. And all of that bought you one thing: proximity. It got you close enough to the actual business to buy your way in. The man who understood that got rich. The man who thought the business was the ship stayed poor, no matter how brilliant his hands. Let me prove it with the two men, because their two lives are the entire lesson. Take William Soper. He died holding an estate near the New Forest. He sat in the Commons 11 times between 1414 and 1449. And, this is almost too perfect, he was appointed a verderer of the Royal Forest, an office that put a shipbuilder in charge of the King's Deer, in woodland absolutely full of oak. Read that sentence again. The man whose trade consumed forests ended his life as a legal guardian of one. Now here's what matters. Soper could not have shaped a keel to save his life. He almost certainly never held an adze in anger. He was not, in the craftsman's sense, skilled at all. Now set him against the master shipwright, the one man on that entire site who could take a curved, irregular tree and see a finished hull hidden inside it, who worked without drawings, no blueprints, no plans, by eye and by memory alone, holding the geometry of a 200-ton warship entirely in his head. The single most skilled human being in the whole enterprise, the man on whom every other wage on that site ultimately depended. And what was he paid? A carpenter's wage for a shipwright's risk. And when the job was finished, he walked home carrying his own tools, because, as we established at the very start, they had never belonged to the yard in the first place. Look hard at the shape of that. The most skilled man in the business owned his tools and nothing else. The least skilled thing in the business, the act of arranging for other men to do the work and taking a position on the outcome, owned land, ships, and a seat in Parliament. And here's the part I need you to sit with, because it's the uncomfortable core of the whole thing. It was not really a question of talent. Soper couldn't shape a keel. The shipwright could do the one thing the entire enterprise physically could not happen without. On every measure of skill, the shipwright wins completely. But Soper had something that had nothing to do with skill. He had the ability to look at a hull leaving his slipway and understand that it was going to keep earning money for 30 years. And, crucially, to make sure that when it did, some of that money came back to him. The shipwright saw a ship. Soper saw a 30-year revenue stream and positioned himself to stand in its path. That's the whole difference. Not better hands. A better place to stand. So the men who got rich in this trade all have one thing in common. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every single one of them, at some point, stopped selling ships. They stopped selling the product and started owning the thing the product produced. Soper stopped being a builder and became an owner. Brigandine turned a 12 pence a day office into a supply monopoly.
It's slipping.
Venice turned a repair garage into an empire. Not one of them got rich making the thing. They got rich standing on the right side of the thing after it was made. And here is the rule this whole strange story actually proves. A rule that has nothing to do with ships and everything to do with now. The profitable half of a business is usually the half that happens after the product is finished. The build is the glamorous part, the part everyone photographs and remembers and writes into the history books. The refit nobody itemized, the stores sold off the stack, the share in the hull, the office worth far more than its salary. The boring, invisible, after-the-fact part, that's where the money always was. The ship is the thing everyone looks at. The ship is the cheapest thing in the yard. Now let's settle the account one final time. 9 things. Walk them with me. The ground reverted to being ground. The slip silted. The saw pits filled in. The smithy sold for what the iron weighed. The pitch house was burned for fuel by somebody who needed a fire more than a business. The timber stack went at the purveyor's price, whatever he decided that was. The tools went home with the shipwright where they'd started. The watchman was paid off and not sorry to go. And the working capital was spent 11 months ago on wages for a ship that belonged to another man from the day the keel was laid. Which leaves exactly one thing unaccounted for. That missing £50 in the Newcastle ledger. The gap between what the clerk wrote and what the job cost. And now, at the very end, you understand what it was. That gap is the entire trade. Medieval shipbuilding survives in the record as a list of materials, because materials are what clerks write down. Timber has a price and a quantity. Nails can be counted. But the part that actually made anyone wealthy, the refit nobody itemized, the coil of rope sold quietly off the stack, the quarter share in a hole in the ground, the office worth 12 pence a day and a fortune in practice, was never going to appear in an account roll because nobody involved had any reason on earth to write it down. Which is why we can tell you, to the farthing, what the iron cost in 1294. And cannot tell you what a single private shipbuilder earned in a year, anywhere, in all of medieval England. The receipts that survive are the ones the state kept, and the state was not interested in your margin. We know what the wood cost. We have almost no idea what the men made. And what's left in the end, when everything else has silted and rotted and been carried off, is a slope of mud with some post holes in it. And a man who now quietly owns 2 ships. That's the whole thing. The wealth was never in the sawdust. It was in the ownership, the office, and the silence of the record. And if that pattern feels familiar, if it sounds a little like the way money still moves today, where the people who make the thing are paid a wage and the people who own the thing collect for 30 years, then you're not imagining it. That's not a coincidence of history. That's the oldest rule in commerce, and we just watched it run in a muddy Welsh riverbank 500 years ago. The names change, the mud changes, the rule does not. Stop selling the ship. Start owning the water it floats on. So here's what I actually want from you. Comment below. And I want a real answer, not a shrug. Do you think William Soper knew exactly what he was doing? The clerk of the king's ships, who also owned ships? The customs officer shipping his own corn past his own searchers? Or was he just a product of the system? A man taking the only rational moves the board allowed? Type yes if you think he knew, or no if you think the system built him. I read these, and I'll pin the best argument for each side, then send this to one person who still thinks history is about kings and battles. One person who believes the story you get in school, the flags, the speeches, the great men. Send them this and tell them to follow the money instead. It might change how they read everything that's happening right now, because the shipyard rule didn't die in 1468. It's running through your economy this afternoon, and next time we go somewhere much closer to home than a riverbank. I'm going to show you an alewife, a medieval woman who brewed and sold ale, who was busy every single day of her working life, whose business never had a quiet moment, and who still went under. Not from laziness, not from bad ale, not from a disaster. She went under on a single collection gap, the money she was owed arriving one beat later than the money she owed. One timing problem in a business that was working perfectly. I've rebuilt her whole ledger from the original evidence, and it explains why busy and solvent are two completely different things, and why that gap has killed more businesses than any fire or war ever did. It's one of 10 dead businesses I've reconstructed, 10 rules that still run modern ones. Follow the money. It always leaves a trail, even when the clerk forgot to write it down.